Welcome to the second week of Research Roundup, where I discuss and summarize the latest research about health that I have run into in the past week. And today, I have a lot to talk about. We're going to be looking at a huge new study about GLP-1 analogues that suggests that these medications could be used for more than just type 2 diabetes or weight loss. We're also going to look at a study that investigated whether depression can change your preference for foods containing protein, fats, or carbohydrates. And finally, whether or not nutrition labeling impacts on what a person is willing to pay for food. So, let's go. So one of the biggest studies on GLP-1 analogues came out late last month, and it gives some really good insight into the potential benefits of these medications. Now, if you didn't already know, GLP-1 analogues are the class of medications that Ozempic, Wegovy, and Mounjaro belong to. And I have done videos on these in the past explaining exactly how they work. So I will put links in the description to those videos if you are curious and wanting more information. But these medications have increased immensely in popularity due to their effects on blood sugar and also weight loss. And while type 2 diabetes is the main reason that this medication was developed in the first place, as time goes on, researchers seem to be finding more evidence that it could help for many more conditions, and that is what this study that got released seems to be pointing towards. So this is the study here, and it involved using health information obtained from the US Department of Veterans Affairs. So this is actually a huge data set. So what this means is that it allows for a very large sample size for the study. Over 200,000 people who use GLP-1 analogues were included in the study, and what they did was they compared how these people went in terms of health benefits and also in terms of side effects compared to people who had other forms of treatment for type 2 diabetes that aren't the GLP-1 analog. These are tablet-based medications that have been around for years that people have been using to treat type 2 diabetes, things like metformin. Now, what they ended up finding was that compared to these other treatments that we currently use for type 2 diabetes, the GLP-1 analogues seem to be associated with a lot more positive health outcomes. And so I think the best way to explain this is by getting you all to look at this figure here, which is in the study. This shows the risk of experiencing certain health outcomes when taking the GLP-1 analogues compared to other standard medications and care that people receive instead. And we can see that these blue bars are showing us the conditions that the GLP-1 analogues actually reduce the risk of. So, take for example heart failure. This is showing us that people taking a GLP-1 analog such as Ozempic had about a 10% lower risk of experiencing heart failure when compared to standard treatments for type 2 diabetes. Bear in mind that's not a huge reduction, to be honest, but the reason that this research is interesting is because of all of the conditions that are here, and there are some really interesting ones. If you look, there is mental conditions like schizophrenia, seizures. We have lung conditions like pneumonia. And for all of these conditions listed here, the GLP-1 analogues reduce the risk of people experiencing them more than the standard treatments currently used for type 2 diabetes. Now, granted, this is only currently in people with type 2 diabetes, but it's a good start to the research. In other words, we could say that GLP-1 analogues potentially protect against all these conditions. And that is why this research is interesting, because until now, the main use case has been type 2 diabetes. And then, of course, people have also been using it for weight loss. But now I think that this research may open the way to investigating other potential uses for the medications. And one area that I think will get a lot of attention is, if we look here, neurocognitive disorders. This includes Alzheimer's disease and dementias. Very rarely do we run into medications that show benefits in helping with these conditions. So I do think that this area will get a bit of attention and more research directed towards it, but as well as many others on this list. Now, this research also confirms what previous studies have found in terms of reducing heart issues in diabetic patients. So again, this is another area that we will probably see research going into. Personally, I am actually very curious about how many of these benefits that we're seeing here are a result of the weight loss that comes from GLP-1 analogues, or potentially just eating a better diet and having an improved lifestyle. Because one of the ways that these medications work is by making you feel quite full, so you do eat less. I would really like to know the specific reasonings behind these outcomes, and that just requires more research. Now, it's not all good news though, because if you do scroll down a little bit, there is a part 2 to this figure, and these are all the conditions that people experience more of when taking a GLP-1 analog. These medications, they do not come without side effects, and we can see straight away that it is a much smaller list, and a lot of these we already knew about. Issues with the digestive system are a fairly common side effect, and we can see here that the most common issue is the nausea and vomiting, which is already very well known about these medications. And honestly, the nausea can be horrible from what I've heard. These medications do have to be carefully used, and clinicians will always weigh the risks and benefits when using them. The one thing that stood out to me though was the pancreatitis. So people tend to be 2.5 times more likely to experience inflammation of the pancreas when taking these GLP-1 analogues compared to other diabetic treatments. If you think about these medicines and how they work, this makes a little bit of sense. The GLP-1 analogues can increase insulin release in your body even when food intake is low, and insulin comes from the pancreas. So this might place a little bit of stress on the pancreas, which could irritate it and cause some inflammation. If you think about it, insulin gets released in response to us eating. If you have something forcing insulin to come out without the food, your body just may get confused. The other thing I did also mention is that GLP-1 analogues make you feel more full, so you eat less. And it does this by actually slowing down digestion. So your pancreas, it sends digestive enzymes to your intestines to help you process and digest food. So if you slow things down, which is what these medicines do, again, this could cause issues with the pancreas. This is just me thinking out loud. That's what I think may be happening and why pancreatitis is so common or more common with these medications. But either way, this is something that I think needs a little bit more investigation and is definitely something people should be aware of when thinking about starting these medications. They aren't perfect, they're not magical, they do come with risks. But nonetheless, it is great to see more and more research come out about the GLP-1 analogues. I think they're an incredibly interesting class of medications, and with how new they are, we will keep getting research updates. And this is definitely just the beginning. So look, I did just spend a lot of time on that one study, but I wanted to make sure it was well covered and that everyone really knew what it found. But let's move on to the next study of this week. This study here looked at the relationship between major depressive disorder and food preferences. So many of us actually associate depression with loss of appetite, and this research wanted to understand whether people with depression have different desires for different types of food. So this study here, it involved 117 adults. Within that was a group of people that were diagnosed with major depressive disorder, and then a control group, which is people that did not have major depressive disorder. They then had to go through images of 60 different foods and rate how much they enjoyed those foods and also how much they desired or wanted those foods. So the researchers, they took these results and they looked into the food and broke them down in terms of carbohydrate, fat, and protein content to see if people with depression favored one of these macronutrients more. And so what the results showed was that overall, people with depression did have a lower desire for food. So they wanted food less than people without major depressive disorder. And this is something that isn't really new information, but the macronutrients did in fact make a difference. So the people that had depression had a lower liking or a desire for high fat, high protein foods, but they liked and wanted the high carbohydrate foods more when compared to the people who didn't have depression. So I've seen before that people with low mood tend to crave these high carbohydrate foods as a temporary relief from their negative emotions. And I think this study seems to just show more evidence to support that. And I just found this study quite interesting. It's prompted me to do a little bit more learning in this area about why this might be the case. Why is high carbohydrate food a bit more desirable in the depressive mental state. I'm a big believer in diet when it comes to mental health, but I think before we can help people with depression by suggesting and telling them what to eat, we need to actually understand what's going on a bit more. So I'll be doing some research into that and putting out a video that looks into this a bit deeper. But if anyone out there already has some insight into this or any personal experience, please comment and let us know if you feel like it. Now, finally, the last study I ran into this past week was actually about labeling on food products of all things. So this new study, it investigated how different labeling on food products can impact on how much people are willing to pay for the food products. So it involved 300 participants who had to say how much they would pay for a certain tub of yogurt in this case. So people were split into 6 groups, and each group had different types of labeling and information about the product to look at. So if you look at the screen here, you can see that one group just had a plain yogurt label, while others had one that said, or had a sticker saying healthy, and then a sticker saying great taste, or one yogurt tub had the great taste plus the healthy labeling on it. So what the study found was that when we had the healthy label on its own, people were actually not willing to pay as much. They wanted to pay 18% less than the normal labeling, which is interesting because I think people making these products and labels assume that if something is labeled healthy, people will think it's better and then they'll pay more for it. But we need to think about the fact that some people also think that healthy reduces the taste, and so they may want it less and they may be thinking it's worth less. So the group that had just the tasty label instead, they had no significant difference to the normal label, which suggests that just telling someone that something is tasty doesn't have as much of an impact as a label that says it's healthy. Now, the interesting thing is when we had taste and healthy together, people wanted to pay even less than just the healthy sticker alone, which is starting to make me think that people are becoming very skeptical of nutrition labeling. It's almost as if they're going, why are you telling me this tastes good? It makes me think it doesn't taste good. In terms of study design, this isn't the strongest. It does only look at one single product, which is the yogurt. It was also a very small group of 300 people. And when you split them into 6, that's even smaller groups. And it didn't give too much insight into whether these labels work or not, because it focused on what price people would pay rather than would they even buy it in the first place. I do want to say, if we look here, if this was the actual labeling that was used, no wonder people wanted to pay less, because they look awful. And it's as if someone randomly put this together in 2 minutes. There is no design element here. So that's why people may have been thinking it was worth less. They could have just thought it was poor quality. Now, I think there's potentially a few reasons behind the results that were found here. But again, this is just a study that I included because I found it was quite interesting to see that these labels aren't quite having the response and effect we want them to have. And nutritional labeling is something that governments and even companies are trying to use to help people to make better choices. So paying attention to what the consumer responds to here is quite important. Otherwise, we are just wasting our time. And so I more so included this study in today's episode because I was curious about how anyone watching this responds to labeling on foods. Does it work for you if you see something labeled as healthy? Would you be more inclined to go for it and buy it? Do you think it might taste worse because it's got the word healthy on it? If something says it's healthy and tasty, then are you more likely to get it? Please let me know your thoughts. I personally ignore the labels and I try and go off my base knowledge of what I think is going to be better for me. I'm more likely to flip it around and look at the ingredients and the nutritional information panel because those things can't really lie. And labeling is pretty much a marketing tool, so I just filter that out and go for the actual facts. So that brings me to the end of today's episode. If you have any questions about any of the studies that I have talked about today, please let me know in the comments, especially if there's anything you would like to actually learn more about. Otherwise, I will see you in the next video, and until then, keep playing the long game.